In this episode, we interview Ben Pronk. Ben is a former SAS soldier with a 24-year Army career. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership in combat and finished his career as a commanding officer. Ben, along with his brother, Dr. Dan Pronk, and Tim Curtis, both also SAS veterans, are authors of the book The Resilience Shield. Ben covers a lot of ground in this episode. You will hear him discuss what resilience is and how this is relevant to frontline emergency service personnel. We discuss how we can improve our resilience through adding things to our lives and some helpful routines to assist with this. He also recommends eliminating certain things to improve our overall well-being. Ben talks about what we should be aware of in ourselves in relation to our mental health. He directs us to an online resilience survey we can complete to get a scientifically backed summary of how resilient we are against the Resilience Shield methodology. There is all of that and a whole lot more. The interview is conducted by Jason Anderson, Josh Alpin, and myself, Tim Stisher. Remember, our mental health is vitally important and something that deserves our attention. I hope you take something from this episode that helps to improve your overall well-being. Please take care of yourselves and those around you. Remember, Pheasant is available if you need any support of any kind. And with that, here is our chat with Ben Pronk.
G'day, Ben. Thanks for joining us today. As we spoke about in your intro and your bio, mate, you've lived a pretty incredible life, through your distinguished military service and things like that. But if you don't mind, let's start with early life and talk about, your childhood and growing up and all things young Ben Pronk.
Yeah, no worries. Well, look, thank you very much for having me on. It's genuinely an honour, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I don't know if young Ben Pronk was that sort of remarkable. Certainly, as I look back on, the sort of resilience building, I wasn't probably the person most likely to be picked as a resilient sort of guy. I was a bit of a fat kid growing up. I had a very stable and wonderful, supportive family, so I had good roots in that regard. But we grew up pretty nomadic. My dad was in the army. We'd move around every couple of years. And so that sort of meant that I was really tight with our nuclear family, mum, dad, and my brother Dan, but sort of not any extended family to speak of, and changing schools every couple of years was pretty turbulent with a lot of those sort of social friendships. And so I suppose that gave some level of resilience from an early stage, and gave a lot of novelty, like it was good living in different places and learning different things. But yeah, it certainly was kept us on our toes in terms of the friendships. I think I'd seen my dad's career. So he was a Army helicopter pilot, and he'd always just loved it. It was, he'd tell us stories about flying survey missions in New Guinea and doing all sorts of amazing things. And it was a real boy's own adventure. And so I think I was attracted to the military from a very early age. And I can't remember a time where I didn't want to sort of join the army. So in many ways, it was kind of an easy path for me to get into there. Probably the hardest bit was, transitioning from being a bit of a fat kid who didn't sort of play much sport. And I was even starting to develop a bit of a smoking habit towards the end of high school because I thought it looked pretty cool. So that was probably the biggest shift that I had to make, sort of going into the military.
Yeah, you're awesome, mate. And so, you were sort of always around the military. Once you sort of got in, were you immediately drawn to Special Forces and namely the SAS?
Yeah, I think, if I'm honest, the catalyst for the idea was probably that book, Bravo 20. I've got to check my pop culture references because I'm very old, and I'm aware that a lot of people probably haven't even heard of this, but this was one of the first big sort of tell-all SAS books out of the British regiment. And that sort of really piqued my interest in this organisation. So I went through the Australian Defence Force Academy, a 3-year degree program, and then the Royal Military College, so 4 years of training. And a lot of that, I was still very much looking at flying. I'd seen Dad enjoy it. There was a real attraction to becoming a helicopter pilot. And so right up until the very end of my time at RMC, I still had a sort of foot in both camps. I'd done the screening for aviation and the sort of basic coordination and aptitude tests and passed that. And it was funny, the real decision point came towards the end of RMC, where you come up to a period where you put in your preferences for what corps, what area of the Army you want to go into. And all of the different corps come in and they kind of pitch. And so, Transport Corps will come in and they'll show you a fancy video with trucks going everywhere and, Land Rovers and fixing things. And, infantry will come in and they really don't have much except for carrying heavy stuff and shooting guns. And then, Armoured Corps would come in and there'd be tanks. And anyway, aviation came in and theirs was by far the slickest video. I'll never forget it. It had AC/DC TNT as the soundtrack and it had helicopters flying through the dawn and, all of this sort of stuff. And I thought, yeah, no brainer. I'm going to go fly helicopters. I'm going aviation. But there was this one scene where the helicopters, the Black Hawks, sort of flew in formation and they flared hard into a hover and they kicked out ropes and all of these people sort of slid down the ropes. And then I'll never forget, they dropped the ropes and the helicopters flew home. And I remember thinking, shit, I don't want to be flying home at that point. I want to be the guy on the end of the rope. And so that was the kind of real turning point. I ended up choosing infantry as my first preference and getting that, and then subsequently going into the SAS a couple of years later.
Hey, Ben, what I find interesting, mate, your brother also joined the Army. You both gravitated towards the same career path. Same family, obviously. So how much does genetics play in a role of resilience? Is it something that you both had the same base resilience, or was it something that you adapted with over time? How did that play out? Because you both went into the SAS, which I find extraordinary on its own.
First thing, thanks for bringing up Dan. I was hoping to avoid that topic because he's pretty much better than me in every facet of life. But it's quite interesting. So first up, I think, and our subsequent research has definitely reinforced that there are big innate components to resilience. So there are genetic bits. Some people are more predisposed through their DNA, through hereditary and genetic aspects, to being resilient, to having certain aspects that correlate with resilience. Strange things like the presence of a neurohormone called neuropeptide Y, which apparently is correlated with resilience. You get that from your parents. You've either got it or you don't at birth, and that can give you a bit of an edge. I don't know if we were sort of naturally from the nature bit predisposed to being particularly resilient. I do think upbringing, and this is another big part of your innate bit, the nurture side of things, I think we did have a good head start. We had very supportive parents. I talk about in the book, one of the biggest gifts my father gave me was this idea that everything is doable, that if someone on this planet can do something, then you can probably get pretty close to it. Now, that doesn't mean everyone can run a Olympic gold medal or whatever. But, if there is a tricky problem, you can probably work it out. If there's a way to fix a car or a washing machine, you can probably figure it out. If people can get into, units like the SAS or elite Ivy League schools, you can probably give it a crack. And so that kind of mentality, as well as the support to try things and fail, I think definitely helped both Dan and I sort of in our later careers. And Dan actually ended up, although we ended up in the same unit in the SAS, he went a very different route. He was while I was a fat kid, he was the little skater boy, sort of graffitiing bloody toilet blocks in our hometown of Toowoomba and sort of rebelling a bit. He was never on that straight path to the military. He ended up doing exercise science as an undergraduate degree and getting into triathlon very heavily, and then sort of really hit his straps and decided he wanted to do medicine, saw an opportunity to do that through defence. And in many ways, I remember thinking at the time, you mercenary little bastard, you're just joining the army to get a free medical degree, and you don't really care about Queen and country like I do, and that sort of mentality. But subsequently, he fell in love with the military just the same way as I did, and gave some incredible service.
Wow. So those conversations around the dinner table with your dad, did he suppress what actually happened, or going back then it was all, do we want to expose our children to too much of what really happens? I know personally I don't talk a lot of shop at home with my daughter.
Yeah.
Was that those conversations, or was it find out for yourself?
It's really funny, and that's an excellent question. My dad had joined the army relatively late, so he'd worked for a number of years. I think he was about 25 or 26 when he went to Portsea, as it was then, the officer training school. And this was at the height of the Vietnam War. So he'd done all his training while Vietnam was raging. Fellow cadets of his had military medals from Vietnam. All his instructors were Vietnam veterans. He graduated very high in his class, did regimental training, did his pilot's course, and graduated with his wings just as Australia pulled out of Vietnam. And so he never actually deployed on operations in Vietnam. And of course, we had a big period of relatively low military activity since then. And so in many ways, he hadn't been exposed to some of those aspects that I know, first responders see on a daily basis, and probably the more contemporary military veterans have seen in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think, and it'd be a great question. He passed a few years ago, but I think he'd never really scratched that itch, and had certainly never been exposed to some of the downsides of these kinds of professions. So he was very much really supportive. He loved his career. He loved flying helicopters. He loved the military. And so, to answer your question, no, there was no sort of filter on in terms of his experiences. But by that same token, he probably hadn't been exposed to some of the higher end sort of stuff that you can get in these kind of careers.
Excellent.
Hey, Ben, for our people, for first responders, from your perspective, can we just rewind and talk about resilience for a moment? Maybe what
Sure.
you see resilience as, and what you see it as the importance for our people in first responding organisations.
Awesome. Tim, this is something that's, it was the genesis of why we wanted to get interested in resilience, why we wrote the book and the work we're doing now. I think there's a lot of parallels between first responders and military in a lot of ways when it comes to resilience. And we'd sort of thought, I'd just assumed that because we're in the army, particularly in a unit like the SAS where you're screened and you do all those selection processes, that we were going to be resilient. And certainly, by and large, people were. They did amazing things under high pressure. But what we started to see was that there were these really different reactions from a very similar group of people exposed to the same stresses. And the often reflects, the real penny drop moment for me was my last mission in Afghanistan. We'd done a night mission. There'd been an engagement and a fairly kind of full-on night, but we'd sort of got through it. We were heading back to base to what we knew was going to be the end of that rotation, a 6-month rotation in country. And, right at the 11th hour, we're just almost within sight of our forward operating base. And all of a sudden, the vehicle in front of me just disappears into this big explosion and hits a roadside bomb. And in that moment, I remember seeing that there were these really different reactions. The vast majority, and I know talking with first responders and in fact people in all walks of life, the vast majority of people do as they've been trained. They go into their training mode, they rise to the occasion, they get through it. But what we saw in that moment, in addition to most people doing that, was some people going above and beyond, really the top of their game, operating absolutely at another level. And what I remember distinctly was one guy in particular who was just inspiring people around him, really rallying the troops in this pretty full-on moment. But he was cracking jokes. He was he genuinely seemed to almost be enjoying himself. He was almost on a high, in addition to performing really well. And I thought, gee, that's a bit weird. This is not a happy moment. And then at the other end of the scale, like literally 10 meters away from this guy, was another bloke who was basically just so overwhelmed by what had happened in that blast that he couldn't function. He was crying and really out of things. And I thought that was a bit weird because we were kind of the same human. And as we observed friends in those sorts of moments, but then in now the years that have followed, we've seen different people have these different reactions. And incidentally, that guy who was on top of his game on that day has subsequently had some pretty serious issues with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this got us kind of really thinking that this idea of resilience isn't just about physical fitness, mental toughness, being there in the moment. It's got to be more than that. So we started to try to look at all of the things that made someone resilient, made a human resilient. And we were really determined to use scientific peer-reviewed literature. We didn't just want to be saying this is what we reckon because we think we're tough because we used to be in the army or any of that sort of stuff. So we started doing a lot of research and eventually identified that there were these 6, I guess, groups of factors that seem to contribute to resilience. And we call them layers within our resilience shield. We call our model the resilience shield. And the 6 layers, really briefly, there's an innate layer, which we touched on before, that nature and nurture. So a bit of genetics, bit of upbringing and epigenetics. There's a mind layer, so the psychological and spiritual aspects that we approach resilience with. There's definitely a body layer, the physiological stuff. Social layer is really important, the support we get from particularly our close friends that we can be authentic and vulnerable with. There's the professional layer, so what we do on a day-to-day basis, if we can find purpose, meaning, and virtuosity in our jobs. And then there's this sort of ghost in the machine that we call the adaptation layer that recognizes that if we can develop resilience in the everyday sort of things that we know, it'll set us up to transfer those into novel or unforeseen challenges. We're able to transfer resilience in a certain extent. So to answer your question, those 6 layers are what we've come to sort of view resilience as. It is multifactorial, it is dynamic, it changes day to day and situation to situation, but it's also modifiable. We can get better at most of those things, and that's what we're really interested in. What are the things that move the needle? To answer you, to sort of go back to your point, Tim, on what does it mean for first responders? I think it really is important to identify that there are a whole bunch of these things that are contributing to your resilience. In many ways, a lot of us tend to put things like our profession and possibly our body, our physical fitness. These are really important things in the kind of roles we're talking about. But we can sometimes do that at the expense of some of those other layers. And what we've seen is that does create vulnerabilities while you're still in the service. But what it can also mean is that if you've overinvested, for example, in your profession, if you identify as a firefighter, as a paramedic, an AMBO, a police officer, a soldier, and all of a sudden that's taken away from you, then you can be pretty rudderless. And we've seen a lot of people suffer as a result of that.
Would you say it's as simple as saying if you have low resilience, you're more susceptible to those things, sort of, like you said, vulnerabilities to maybe anxiety, depression, PTSD? Is it as simple as that, or is there more to it?
Can I answer yes and no?
You can answer however you want.
I do think it. I do think it is. In some ways as simple as that if you are able to build up those different areas, you are going to be less susceptible to those kind of stress-related issues. However, the real importance, I think, of understanding the innate layer is recognizing that people are vastly different in terms of the way they have a baseline in these kind of things. And certainly some of those things that you've mentioned, conditions like depression, anxiety, and these sorts of stress-related conditions, they can have elements that are genetic. They certainly can have elements that are exacerbated by your upbringing. And so what works for one person isn't going to work for another. And so it's really important not to compare two people's, either their reaction against the same stressor, like you come out of a burning building and one person might be, unaffected, another person might be really shaken up. We shouldn't be comparing and saying this person's weak and this person's strong or any of that sort of stuff. We're on different baselines. So I think that's one thing. And the second thing is to recognise that not every sort of the interventions that we know build resilience are going to have the same effect on the same people. And so a big part of what we're trying to do is get people to think about, well, what different aspects within their life might be relatively strong. Like maybe they're super fit and really committed and getting a lot out of their job, but what might be a little weaker? Where might the tide be out? So maybe they're not doing enough stuff in the mind space in terms of mindfulness and stress reduction and emotional regulation type activities, or maybe they're not investing in their family and those lifelong social connections enough, and that could be providing a vulnerability. So my answer would be yes. Addressing those layers is going to help and reduce your susceptibility to those kind of things, but not to the same levels for every single person. It is an individual type of approach.
So, Ben, on that, you touched on the 6 different layers within the Resilience Shield model. Is there any of those layers in particular that are, say, more pertinent than others that have a bigger contribute greater to our resilience?
Absolutely. The short answer is yes. The mind layer does seem to be more fundamental than others, and certainly from our research, we've done an ongoing body of research with the University of Western Australia, and in fact, they published a peer-reviewed article in August 22 that served as an empirical evaluation of our model. Essentially, we've been collecting data through a resilience survey, which I can come back to in a second, but we threw about 20,000 survey responses at UWA, and basically they said, yes, your model doesn't suck, that these things do contribute independently and in a statistically significant way. They are relatively even in terms of their contribution, but the mind layer is, I guess, the first amongst equals. We view that as the foundation upon which all other resilience is based. And I think this is important because for a lot of people, I'd argue for a lot of males, I'd probably argue for a lot of first responders, this is an area where we can do some improvement. When I look back on my own career, and it seems to be paralleled in a lot of the police, fire and ambulance services we work in, awesome on, for us, the physical training, awesome on the technical training, the martial skills, the legal skills, the I don't know, connecting hose skills. I don't know much about firefighting, I'm afraid. But, we get really good at the stuff we need to do. But where I think we leave money on the table is in some of those mental skills. I think ability to emotionally regulate under high pressure situations, ability to de-stress, to bring us back from that chronic stress state. I think this is an area where we could really invest. And I think it would really, really help us make better decisions under pressure and give us longevity. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I think particularly in the first response over the military community, just the ongoing exposure to really extraordinary trauma that you guys are dealing with, guys and girls are dealing with and have normalized. I imagine, I genuinely couldn't imagine going to a car crash involving kids, that sort of thing leaves me in a cold sweat. Whereas your community is doing that with frequency. And one of the things the body does stress inoculate. You become better at operating in those moments over time through exposure and support. And that's a good thing. That allows you, and thank God that you and your community are doing that. But what it also means is that the subjective level of stress might seem pretty low. You've come back from your 50th awful car accident and you don't feel that worked up. But, and I'm using the title of a very famous book on the subject, The Body Keeps the Score. Your body is still, when it's exposed to those kind of stressors, exhibiting a stress response. It's releasing hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. It is having this kind of elevation of your stress state. Even though you don't feel like it's shaking you up, it adds up and it can tend to be cumulative. And if we're not practicing techniques that can help sort of bring this stress state down, bring our what they call our autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight type response. If we can't get that back into the rest and digest or the parasympathetic state, then we end up essentially in chronic stress. We may not even feel it, but basically we're like a car engine that's idling at 7,000 revs. Even when we're relaxed, we're still running hot. We're oozing adrenaline and cortisol. And so this is where I think some of those mind layer activities, things like mindfulness, things like meditation, breathing exercises, gratitude, grounding, and perspective taking, some of these really deliberate practices you can do are very, very good at helping to lower that state.
Ben, I'm going to be selfish here because it's not every day I get to talk to an elite commander from the SAS. So as a leader, what is... I'll give you an example of a system or a process that I use. If we go to a job, it may be the car accident or whatever it is. If it's a job that has affected me in some way, I'll turn to the crew and say, wow, that hurt. Because I feel by me being vulnerable, it allows them to perhaps speak up. Would that be fitting, or is that a technique that you would use?
Absolutely. I was going to say, I guess some of the risk factors in these kind of environments, we've just spoken about the stress where there is extraordinary stuff that is going to have an impact. There's a series of expectations within these kind of roles that it almost makes it difficult for people to say things like that, because you're the guys and girls that are charging into the burning building when everyone else with any sort of common sense is running the other way. The police and ambos are rushing towards the sound of the accident or the sound of the guns when everyone else is clearing out. And so there's this real drive in the culture to be that tough person, to go into the fire when everyone should be running out. And yet what that can tend to create is an environment where people think when they're serving in these roles that it is weak to say that impacted me. There can be a feeling that if I admit that was nasty or extraordinary or rattled me a bit, then people are going to perceive me as weak or whatever. And exactly what you've described is such a powerful antidote for well-respected and senior members in these organisations to normalise that kind of response, to actually be able to say, that was pretty messed up. And even to the point of, we saw it in the military in the SAS, as some of the more senior and respected guys started saying after 4 or 5 tours, look, I'm not sleeping that well. Some of this stuff is starting to come back. I'm going to go see a counsellor. I'm going to go get some assistance. Having that vulnerability, when we're doing it, we can often feel like that may be showing weakness. But when you see it happen, I always think that shows strength. Someone being able to say, yeah, gee, that rattled me, or yeah, I'm going to get some help with this to keep myself as sharp as possible. That to me is really strong. And so to answer your question, again, a very long-winded response, absolutely. That kind of normalization and that kind of discussion, I think, is incredibly powerful. I think it's incredibly healthy. And every time I've seen it done, people want to talk. People will latch on. It almost gives permission to have these really healthy conversations and to start that process. Particularly if people do need clinical help, for example.
Excellent. And please answer if you like those conversations after that situation that you described on that way home from that incident. Was there conversations had around like a debrief, or how does that play out in your command?
Very much
under your command.
Yeah, we talk a lot in the book about this after action review process, and it's something that military and a lot of first response organisations do quite well. And yeah, there's an element there where we're trying to capture lessons learned and get the technical stuff up for the next time. But I always reflected how much of a human and cathartic sort of process that structure could be. Just going back over and normalising, how people felt and what happened, and acknowledging that this was extraordinary, that you shouldn't be expected to see, the results of human violence or really destructive car crashes or injured people and dead people. You shouldn't be expected to see that and not be impacted, and so those after action reviews can have a really good technical output, but I think they're also really important to allow people to talk about this. And if they're done in the way that you've just described, in a healthy and vulnerable sort of way or an authentic way, then it really gives permission for the organisation to start processing these things and to acknowledge that they are impactful. And it can be really deceptive because generally, as I said, people are impacted by this stuff. It's a very human response. But if no one's talking about it, there's a real tendency to look around and everyone's just getting on with work and you're thinking, wow, I'm the only one who's messed up by that. I'm the only one who found that weird. And that can be very alienating. You start thinking something's wrong with you when that's obviously not the case. Just having that conversation and realizing, no, that was weird. That was extraordinary or unusual. That can go a long way to making people able to process and deal with it.
Well, thanks for the insight.
Ben, I'd like to just rewind to something you said a little bit earlier, and I love that you brought up the idea of the body keeps the score and the fact that, our mental and emotional state is going to have some manifestation in our physical state. So I think we, in our industry, are probably better at identifying physical problems within ourselves than emotional or psychological problems. So if we reverse that statement about the body keeps the score, is there anything that we can give to our people to say there are some physical symptoms you can look for to say that perhaps your resilience needs a little bit of work or you're more susceptible to stress? Or is it always going to be in the one direction?
No, I think it's... I love using those sort of physical and mental analogies, and certainly I remember in the unit that the second you tweaked your hamstring, you'd be to the physio, you try and get a rehab program, you'd get on top of it, and maybe you can't work to full capacity for a couple of weeks while you build back up, but you'd have a rehab program and that sort of stuff. But if we're having mental issues, for a long time it was like, oh, I'm not going to do anything about it. And, it seems nuts. Why wouldn't we? If our mental performance is impacted, why wouldn't we be straight to the psych and potentially having to step back in the same way you would in a physical injury for a period while you're rehabbed? So I think the closer we can get to an understanding that mental illness in many, can be viewed in similar ways to that physical injury, and that we can do rehab to help both, and we should be viewing them in similar rehabilitation pathways. I think that can be really healthy. But I think part of that, Tim, as you identified, it is easy to know when you've done a hammy or pulled an Achilles or something like that. It can be a bit harder with mental health issues, particularly if they're chronic, if they come in slowly. But the kinds of things that we do want to be sort of on the lookout for things like repetitive and intrusive thoughts. If we can't get something out of our head, what they call maladaptive rumination, we've got a particular incident on loop in our head and we can't shake it. Impacts on sleep. Sleep in itself, we might talk about later, is such a superpower, and one that's, I think, traditionally undervalued in a lot of jobs. But if we're not able to sleep, if we're not sleeping well, and even little things like tracking your sleep, even just your time of bed and time of wake, let alone if you can get some biometric data from a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something, that can be really good indicators. Things like heart rate variability and resting heart rate from some of the more sophisticated bio trackers, they can be awesome benchmarks for, if your baseline stress state is creeping up over time. So you can use some of those technical things. But even the more subjective ones, like, are you arguing with people a lot more? Are you sort of not excited about things as much? Are you sort of tend to be more negative about things? Those kind of aspects, if you're able to self-identify or you've got the ability to have conversations with close associates or loved ones that can sort of act as a benchmark for those, they can be your sort of symptoms that, maybe things, I'm about to pull a hammy in my brain, if you like. We're about to have a mental injury.
And I think that goes back to what Jace was saying before about the vulnerability too. If we start those vulnerable conversations with each other, I think it's going to lead to a lot more receptiveness from each of our peers to start having those conversations to say, I'm about to pull a hammy in my brain. So that rewinds to where Jace was talking about before with having those vulnerable conversations post-incident, but also just in general terms as well.
I think so. And I think the other thing linked to that is that when there's a physical injury, we can understand the mechanism of injury. I've done my Achilles because I exploded out of a sprint when I wasn't warmed up, and I know the muscle fibers have torn. You can sort of get that, and you can sort of understand, okay, well, I've got to strengthen my calf, I've got to do some stretching, I've got to do some rehab, all that sort of stuff. It can be a bit more daunting when it's a mental injury. It can just seem this awful, oh my God, mental injury or depression or whatever, and very inaccessible. Now, two things here. The first one is none of what we're talking about in the Resilience Shield, none of it says we shouldn't be seeking professional help with this. Just like you would go to a physio, if you are getting these symptoms, particularly up to that sort of clinical point where it's really having an impact, you've got to get help. There are professionals who can do this, and maybe we can come back to talk about the role, particularly of psychologists in that space. So this isn't about doing stuff yourself or sucking it up. We absolutely view professional help as an important part of this journey. But having said that, there are some things you can do yourself that are going to start helping these. And I think it can be really empowering to understand the benefits of some of these activities. And this is where I am talking about things like mindfulness and meditation activities, where I'm talking about things like breathing activities, talking about things like gratitude. All of these things tend to sound very woo-woo. And I've often joked, I was pretty cynical about it. If you'd come to me as this kind of thought I was tough SAS guy and said, mate, you should be meditating more, it'll make you a better soldier, and I would have just thought, hippies and mung beans and incense and stuff. I was very wrong. When you start looking at the science, the peer-reviewed, repeatable sort of experiments, all of it demonstrates that this isn't a woo-woo or an in-your-head thing. This is just straight neuroplasticity. If we are doing these activities that can promote focus, can promote relaxation, then we are going to have a very positive and repeatable effect on our ability to override what's called the amygdala response, that fight or flight sort of red mist type response that makes it hard to make good decisions under pressure and also makes it hard to get back down to that baseline rest and digest stage. So these things are not woo-woo. It's not about getting your crystals out and hoping for a cosmic, karmic sort of intervention. It's actually just a physiological process. You are lowering your stress state, your autonomic nervous system. You are bringing it back down into a parasympathetic state, both in the moment to help you make better decisions and to stay calm under pressure, but also over time to stop those little niggles becoming, major mental health injuries.
Ben, you often hear in conversation about, I guess, leading back to vulnerability, if someone speaks up, they're all of a sudden a weak link in that chain. And I can only imagine, in the SAS world, that would be a massive mind shift to, A, put your hand up and say, I'm not feeling the best because I'm going to let you down, you down, you down. And I think we have that same thought of potentially, am I still going to be employed if I raise my hand and, am I still going to be able to work as a team? There's still a little bit of that around that we see. And I guess exactly what we're talking about today with this resilience, this is what we want to improve.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I'd be lying to say that doesn't still exist in a lot of areas. I genuinely believe, though, that it is getting better in most of these quarters. Certainly in my military career over that trajectory, particularly the Afghanistan campaign, I did see it improve in terms of the reduction of the stigma associated with getting help for mental health issues. I mean, the first parallel or the first point that I'd like to draw is, again, back to that physical injury. If someone's got a dodgy hamstring, they are potentially going to have to monitor that so that they're not going to be a liability charging into the burning building. You blow your hamstring out. Again, I don't know. I assume you carry heavy ladders and hoses upstairs. You do that in the heat of the moment. You're a liability to your team. If you haven't rehabbed that injury properly. And so it's the same, I think, or it's the same way to view a mental health injury. If you are having issues, you need to get help, and you need to get that rehab up to a point where you can come back and operate to full performance. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing, I think, is about maybe even just, it's definitely a shift of perspective. It could even be a shift of semantics, but in a lot of organisations, and I know a lot of the state police forces we work with, there is still a view that the psychologist is the person who takes away your badge and gun. That all that sort of group does is deem you unfit for service, and so the last thing you want to do is go and see them. Now, clearly, that's not the case. I mean, that is part of I guess the extreme end of what sometimes has to be done. Just like in a physical context, if you can't operate physically, you're not going to get sent into the front line. But I think working at an organisational level to sort of change the focus of what these kind of people, psychologists and counsellors, these kind of support elements do and are perceived as. I see psychs in many ways similar to physical training instructors. They have got tools that can help you build up both rehab if you have had an injury, but build up your fitness to be optimised for job performance. And so certainly in a lot of military units, we're seeing the psychs well and truly integrated into human performance or human optimisation type cells. So it's no longer this sort of extreme end of the road that you get before they ship you off into retirement. It is now part of, well, how do we get people better? Left of incident, how do we sort of get them stronger in a mental sense? And I think that can be an important perspective change. If we're able to get psychs in that proactive sense, offering these tools, offering support pre-injury, so getting people more mentally resilient before a sort of acute or chronic injury, then I think that's going to help a lot in terms of that stigma.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you bring up there, Ben, is that traditionally, I think in terms of our mental health, we've been really reactive rather than proactive. So I think this is a great step to bring people into that proactive mindset. So if someone was coming into this and listening to this as a first responder or a first responder's family member or friend or anything, anybody who is interested in maintaining and improving their mental well-being, where would you suggest is a good place for someone to start who has never had any exposure to this before?
Look, very parochially, I'd say do the Resilience Shield survey. We designed that. I alluded to it before. It was part of our research tool to try and work out how these different bits, these layers of resilience sort of work together. But what it also does is it gives the participant a result. So it tells them sort of where they sit on a bell curve against the survey database, about 25,000 people, so where they're sort of sitting relative to that. But importantly, it also tells them their relative strengths and weaknesses across the various layers. Now, the reason I think this is important is because what we saw as we were starting to look at resilience is a lot of one-size-fits-all sort of stuff, like saying meditation is great for resilience. Now, I can't argue with that, but if you're a Buddhist monk sitting meditating for 10 hours a day and me telling you to meditate for your resilience, it's not going to make a difference. There are going to be some people who are killing it like that. Likewise, physical exercise is brilliant for your resilience. But if you're an Ironman triathlete, me telling you to go for a brisk walk isn't going to move the needle. So the resilience survey allows you to benchmark where you're currently sitting. Couple of points on it. We present the results against a bell curve. We have And including just recently, the odd person write back and say, your survey is bullshit. I'm very resilient. I only got 48% and blah, 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 bit of a rant there. Don't worry about the figures. We wrestled with how we'd present it, but what this is trying to do is just give you something. So don't worry about the actual figures. The things that we really want people to focus on is that relative difference between the layers. And the second thing is to answer honestly. You could probably answer the survey aspirationally. Yeah, I get 9 hours of sleep a night and I only eat vegetables and fish heads and, exercise and blah, blah, blah. But the more honestly you answer it, the better snapshot you're going to get of where you might want to focus your efforts. So that would be my recommendation as a bit of a start point. Get an understanding of where you're already pretty good in terms of your resilience practices and where the tide might be out. And then from there, that can allow you to focus where you want to spend a bit of effort. As I said, for a lot of us, it's probably that mind layer might be an area where a lot of people, first responders, I think probably as a demographic particularly so, could benefit from. And from there, you can start looking at activities within that are going to fit your lifestyle. Like I said, formal meditation, I think, is brilliant. I think it is really, that strength training for your brain. But there are lots of different mindfulness activities that can have similar sorts of benefits, and that may be a nice pathway into that. Grounding activities, breathing activities, these kind of things can have similar sort of benefits and allow people to sort of experiment with that. So look, the first thing, like I said, that self-diagnosis through something like the survey can be really useful, and then identifying these things that are going to be sustainable to build into your own life to address those areas that might be relatively weak. That's what I'd offer as that sort of first point, Tim.
Okay, fantastic. And we will include some information on that at the end of this where people can access that survey.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely.
Ben, how adaptable is that to children? We all have children of our own at home. Obviously, the external pressures that they've in this whole new world of social media. How can this be sort of relayed down to them as a tool that they can do every day to try and build their resilience?
Oh, absolutely. And we very much, with all our research and all the development of the model, designed it to be as universal as possible. So we would offer that the principles hold regardless of the demographic we're talking about. The thing with kids that I think is really interesting and worth noting, the first one is that particularly teenage kids are going through this really high period of neuroplasticity. So this is your brain changing. Now, we now know that your brain changes throughout your life. You can teach old dogs new tricks and you can sort of develop neural pathways even in later age. But this is happening on speed when you're a toddler, when you're learning to walk and talk and that your arms are connected and all that sort of stuff. And then as an adolescent. And by adolescence, for males, we're talking about up to the age of 25 or 26. This is a long period where your brain is still changing a lot. What this means is a couple of things. One is that there are susceptibilities to doing things that might be a little rash. There's a lot of exploration. We're trying to find agency and identity during this period. And so this is why traditionally teenagers have done dumb shit, and teenagers into early adulthood, particularly for males, drive cars fast and shoplift and thrill seek and do these sort of risky behaviours. So I think it's important to be aware of that there's a natural part of this that is about exploring boundaries and agency. The second thing is it does have a massive impact and reiterates the real importance of sleep, because a lot of this neuroplasticity occurs when we're in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is one of the restorative phases of sleep. Now, this tends to happen later in the sleep cycle, and what also tends to happen is that teenagers tend to shift their circadian rhythm, their sleep-wake cycle, to the right. So they tend to want to go to bed later and they tend to not want to get out of bed early. I'm experiencing that firsthand with my daughter at the moment, but you can see that a lot. And so it's important to recognise wherever we can, we teenagers are going to need more sleep. Their sleep cycle is going to shift to the right. And so we want to be aware of the importance of that for their neuroplastic growth. But in short, for children of all ages, the same principles do apply. And it's awesome to see a lot of schools starting to bring in some very age-appropriate versions of the resilience interventions we know are very useful. Even things, colouring in, for example, is a fantastic mindfulness activity. A kid focused on colouring a picture is absolutely in that zone. We're seeing people doing, a school we worked with recently talks about breathing in the flower and blowing out the candle. So getting these kids to imagine smelling a flower and then blowing out a candle, which is a beautiful breathing technique, slowing down your breathing, emphasizing the exhale. Even these things, and this is going to be poor audio as I'm tracing my hands, but, tracing your fingers with in-breaths and out-breaths as you go up and down. These sort of techniques are being taught in schools. You can absolutely teach them and normalize them at home. Gratitude is another massive one that can be really fun to do with families, talking at the end of the day about, cool things that have happened to you, things that have made you laugh, things that you're thankful for, things that made you happy today. These kind of rituals can build in good resilience building practices in the home. The bottom line, like all of these things, I view them, again, it's this physical analogy. It's like doing one rep in the gym. It is not going to change your bicep size overnight. None of these things are going to, in and of themselves, done once, they're not going to change your life. But just like going to the gym, they do work, and they do work over time. If you can make these things habits, they absolutely move the needle. And so the more you can do to normalize these behaviors visibly at home, then obviously you're doing yourself some benefit, but you're just creating that white noise in the background where your kids see that this is something that is done and it is something that is part of a healthy lifestyle.
Excellent.
Awesome. Hey, Ben, you've touched a couple of times on the importance of our sleep. Us in this first responder role, we obviously work shift work, we work overnight, and sleep can be a bit of an issue for us. Can you give us some specific tools or strategies that we can do to improve our sleep hygiene?
Yeah, absolutely. So right up front, there's a lot of really interesting emerging research on sleep. The short answer is we don't exactly know why and how it all works. And that's still kind of cutting edge research looking at that. But the general consensus is that adults need about 7 to 8 hours of sleep per circadian rhythm period, so think per night, and we'll come back to shift work in a second. They also need not only that quantity, but the sort of quality. The real restorative sleep occur in the sleep phases, deep sleep, where your body repairs itself. You get stuff like testosterone and human growth hormone. This is where we physically repair, and our body tends to prioritize that. That tends to happen first. And then that REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, where your brain repairs itself. It flushes out physically debris with cerebrospinal fluid, but this is also where we believe neuroplasticity occurs, where dreams seem to occur, where consolidation of memories occur. And this is apparently, there's a hypothesis that this is really, really important for processing of trauma, that potentially people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, they haven't essentially parked traumatic memories into their hippocampus. And an interesting part of that is, you can probably, if you're not suffering from PTSD, you can think back to a time where you've been scared. Like you can think of a roller coaster ride you went on, or maybe even a gunfight in my context, or a really tough situation in a fire context. You can think back to that without getting the awful fight or flight and nerves and sweats and all that sort of stuff. What this hypothesis, which is sort of promoted by a guy called Matthew Walker in his book Why We Sleep, he talks about the idea that maybe post-traumatic stress disorder patient or sufferers haven't detached the emotion or that physical response from that memory. So every time they're reminded of that situation, like a car backfires or they smell a certain smell, or I don't know, if smoke sort of brings you back to certain fires or whatever, those kind of triggers, every time that happens, they get that same physical reaction that they had the first time, because they haven't sort of been able to detach that through the process of REM sleep. Anyway, sorry, a sidebar, but the real sort of takeaways is that sleep, really important, but in particular those restorative phases which happen at the end of the sleep cycle. So what this means is if we're just getting little pockets of sleep, we can probably keep functioning. So studies by NASA suggest that little naps can keep you physically functioning, but we're not getting that deep restoration. We're not getting those sort of processing in the body and mind restoration. So that is a baseline. In terms of the things that can help improve sleep hygiene, one of the biggest ones is sleep routine. Now, if you've had kids, we often joke one of the best things you can do for your sleep is not have kids, but most of us still make that mistake. And so if you have kids, when they're babies, you know that lead up to sleep, it is a lockstep set routine, isn't it? You have the shower, you get into the comfy PJs, you dim the lights, you get the teddy, you sing the lullaby, you have a kiss, you turn the lights. There's that nice pattern that's telling this little human, okay, now it is time to go to sleep. They're programming or reinforcing that circadian rhythm. And so that is a really healthy sort of way to get your body ready for sleep. As adults, we tend to just go full bore and then decide, okay, pull on the handbrake, time to go to sleep. Different time each night, different lead up, all that sort of stuff. And then we wonder why we can't. So we want to be thinking like a baby. Same bedtime, starting sleep and wake times, if we can get them as consistent as possible, that's really important. And then some kind of routine. Now, to look at the sort of science, some of that routine I would suggest is cutting out blue light. So screens and devices, if not completely a digital twilight, then at least trying to filter the blue light, reducing stimulating activity. And I include in that things like video games, online gaming, certainly social media is a very stimulating activity, that dopamine response. And Jason, I think you mentioned before, that's a thing that our kids are dealing with that we didn't have to as we were growing up. So those sorts of things are going to be counterproductive to your sleep. Reducing things like caffeine intake, even after about midday, caffeine's got a really long half-life. It sticks around. And so, by tailing that off, that can help your sleep hygiene. Having a warm shower. Now, your body actually wants to be quite cool when it goes to sleep. In terms of your room hygiene, the darker and the cooler, ultimately about 18 degrees Celsius is what you're aiming for in terms of your room. But you can help your body get colder, paradoxically, by having a warm shower. So if you introduce a warm shower, it's going to trigger your body to cool down. Just as, and this is another part of sleep hygiene, when you wake up, if you have a cold shower, if you have that kind of cold plunge or something like that, that will trigger your body to heat up and wake up and get ready for the day. So those kind of things, a set bed routine, somewhere in there a digital twilight, some relaxing rather than stimulating activities, reducing the stimulant substances, and having that hot shower and a cold, dark room are going to help. Real quick one on shift work. Shift work is really tough on sleep, clearly. A big part of what drives our circadian rhythm is sunlight. Early exposure for sunlight can be excellent to get you into a circadian rhythm, particularly if you're traveling jet lagged. If you can get early morning sunlight in your new time zone, that'll help your body reset. Clearly, we're fighting against that when we're on. What did you describe it, Josh? Sleepover barbecue roster.
I'm glad that stuck with you, Ben.
We can edit that out.
I thought that was brilliant. But it is tough. What that means is you've got to try to be more as disciplined as you can with those things, like the hygiene, the room temperature and light, and then that pattern into sleep. And so the big thing we're seeing with shift work is if they can get a sleep routine that they use regardless of whether they're on shift or off, it can really help that body just recognize and prime it that, okay, it is time to go to bed, even though the sun's just coming up.
Wow. I'll be doing a lot of that.
Okay.
Staying along that vein of those practical tools and strategies, Ben, talking about that mindfulness, meditation, breathwork stuff, I find that there can be a few barriers to that, like culturally or even just within ourselves. How can you advise that we can access that? What are some really quick tips that we can use to sort of get into that as an entry into that?
Awesome. I think for me, one of the easiest sort of gateway drugs into the whole realm of mindfulness and meditation is breathing. I think most people, once they understand the physiology behind breathing, can sort of understand how this can help. Now, the real cliff notes of this, when your body goes into that fight or flight response, there's a couple of universal kind of reactions. You tend to get elevated heart rate, you tend to get sweaty palms, you tend to get elevated temperature, your breathing goes shallower and more rapid. You get stuff like mind fog and loss of fine motor skills and gastrointestinal sort of issues. All of these sort of things come on, right? Now, there's only one of those that you can control. If, you can't lower your adrenaline output, or you can't increase your fine motor skills, or, lower your heart rate by 20 beats a minute deliberately. But you can control your breathing. It's part of your autonomic nervous system, so it happens in the background, but it's also connected to a skeletal muscle, your diaphragm, so you can control it. So this, I think, is really unique. It gives you this one lever that you can control that can impact your emotional arousal state. And so by manipulating our breath, we can either elevate our arousal state, so breathing faster will tend to pump us up, or more importantly, if we're trying to calm down, slower breathing with an emphasis on the exhalation, the out breath, is going to have a calming effect. And so even just building those sorts of things into the day, again, I can send you the notes. We just did a podcast with a lady called Rachel Vickery, who talks brilliantly about breathing, and she talks about working to reset our baseline breathing. So the way we're breathing normally, we tend to breathe very shallow and very upper chest as a normal thing. And she's got some great exercises to try and reprogram ourselves to breathe deep and diaphragmatically through our diaphragm, but also some of the deliberate breathing techniques in the moment. There's one called the physiological sigh. Again, I can send you a link to this. This is something that a guy called Andrew Huberman champions, but a really quick, it's basically a double intake, sort of second sharper intake, and then a big, long, slow exhale, a really quick reset in the moment. So those kind of things, I think, are great tools to have in and of themselves, but they're also good ways to start getting people into this idea of just focusing on one thing, slowing down their emotional state. And I think that's a good gateway drug, as I said, into wider meditation. From there are a ton of apps out there: Calm, Headspace, another great one, Insight Timer, that have got really accessible and free sort of entry programs. Again, I think there's a big element of normalization here. I think it still is seen as fringe and a bit hippie and woo-woo and kind of zen. The more that people can experiment with this, and if they are finding benefit from it, to normalize and say, hey, this is something that I found either helps me sleep, is a good circuit breaker in the day, whatever, then that conversation starts to become just more natural and normal.
The great things that you've said to introduce into people's lives, Ben. You're talking about a good sleep routine, breathing, introducing a bit of breath work and all that. What about things that you would really recommend people cut out of their lives?
Gee, it's harder and harder to be an advocate for drinking. Now, this is hypocritical for me because I'm not a teetotaler, and even in a resilience perspective, can be a really good part of social interaction. I do enjoy, you have a beer with a mate, watch the sunset, talk, normalize, whatever traumas, that sort of stuff. It can be really good from a social context, but it's pretty hard from a health perspective to sort of defend. There's not a lot of benefits from a health perspective, and in particular from a sleep perspective. I do track my sleep. I've been doing it for a couple of years, and I would offer to people with any of these things, treat yourself as an experiment. Like, actually try these things and see if it moves the needle, either subjectively, how you feel, or objectively, if you're tracking things like heart rate variability, resting heart rate, sleep. see if making these little changes has a difference. For me, as I've started looking at alcohol consumption, every single time that I drink after about 7 p.m. at night, or I have more than about 2 standard drinks, then it's going to impact my sleep and my recovery every time. It's like, it's clockwork. It's cause and effect. And what this means is I'm now a little bit more conscious, I think, in my drinking. So if I'm going to have a couple of beers with a mate because it's a great event and I'm catching up with this person or family or whatever, the juice is worth the squeeze. I'm getting goodness out of that activity. It's for a purpose. But what I found I'm really questioning now is that sort of drinking out of habit. Get home after a day and crack a beer. I'm sort of starting to think, gee, do I really need this? Am I just doing this out of reflex? And if I cut out these couple of beers tonight, I know, because I've been tracking and seeing how it works for me, I know I'm going to sleep better. I know I'm going to feel better tomorrow. I know I'm going to perform better in exercise or whatever. So, yeah, I probably don't need that one. The third one, Tim, and this is a really important one, if you feel you need to drink to get to sleep, then this is a really big warning sign. Alcohol is a depressant. It does actually help you get to sleep. And the insidious part is, particularly if you have got those intrusive ruminating, maladaptive rumination, they call it, these bad thoughts rattling around in your head. Sometimes people feel that the only way they can get rid of those is to have a few beers. It slows your brain down. They stop thinking about this stuff and they go to sleep. Sounds good so far, but unfortunately, what tends to happen is alcohol has a massive impact on your sleep. It tends to wake you up. It's got a half-life of about 6 hours. So it's that classic wake up at sort of 2 a.m. Probably need to go to the loo, but then often your mind starts racing again. Now, coincidentally, 2 a.m., that period is about when you're starting to go into those really restorative sleep phases. So essentially what you're doing is you're torpedoing that really helpful sleep, and you're going on to this really negative spiral. So the two things I'd say with booze, and yeah, like I said, if you can get rid of booze completely, you're probably doing yourself a lot of favors. If you still like a drink, absolutely, I'm not saying abstinence, but check why you're drinking. If the juice is worth the squeeze, if it's for a social activity, if it's going to make life better, crack on. If it's just out of habit, then check whether you really need to do that and whether you can break in a few alcohol-free nights through your week. And if it's because you feel you need to, then you're probably on a pretty negative spiral here. And we want to look at other ways. And this is where I would suggest that's where we want to be speaking to a counsellor or a psych. There are other techniques we can use, things like meditation, things like talk-based therapy, things like journaling. There are other ways of getting those negative thoughts, breaking that cycle, other than trying to just drown it in Jack Daniels.
Wow, good advice.
So Ben, you touched on the fact that you're conscious about your alcohol consumption. Is there any other, non-negotiables that you have, or some things that you yourself employ to make sure you're maintaining your own resilience?
Look, sleep is increasingly becoming a it's not a non-negotiable, but it's one that I'll fight to sort of keep wherever I can. I do a lot of travel, which kind of tends to torpedo it, but I'm super conscious about that. So I really do try and prioritise sleep. And that does link into things like coffee and alcohol consumption because of the impact that they have on that. So I'm still consuming both, not as we speak. I'm like I'm sober for this conversation, but I'm a bit more aware of the impacts that's having. So sleep's another big one. Exercise for me is so enormous. It's obviously good for you physically, and that's a big component of the body layer in our model. But I find it is massive for me mentally. In fact, I was having this conversation, with Hugh Van Cuylenburg, who is an awesome guy. He wrote a book called The Resilience Project. He does the Imperfects podcast. Really deep thinker on a lot of these sorts of things. But he and I were reflecting on how important running is to both of us. Almost to the point where we're worried if we get injured and can't run, it's going to be this big negative thing in our life. So maybe we're over invested in that. But it is yeah, if I don't exercise, I feel a bit ratty and don't feel that good. So I try to build something in most days in that respect. And the other one that I've found is really, it's not so much a non-negotiable, but I found it's really useful is journaling. Now I had a rocky road with journaling when I started. I've done it. I've kept diaries on and off through my life, and I sort of started doing it again a few years ago. And I had this thing where I felt I had to journal every day and I had to get everything that I did that day down and I had to solve all the problems. And then if I missed a day, I had to go back and make it up and then I had to fill it in and it became a stressor, which is ridiculous. It's absolute opposite of what it's supposed to be. So the approach I've got now is I view it very much as a tool and I find it incredibly useful when I'm starting to get those thoughts spiraling around and when I'm catching myself thinking negatively, particularly about relationships in my life or things that are going on, just dumping it out of my head onto paper has an amazing way of giving some distance. Often I'll dump this onto paper and think, shit, this is a dictionary definition first world problem. This is not the end of the world. It gives that sort of perspective. Very often, as I'm writing, my wife did this, or my kids have done that, or my business partner Tim's done this, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm starting to vent, and then I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, oh, actually, maybe I'm the asshole in this situation. I get this different perspective and it sort of defuses it and it makes it a bit more bearable. But the other thing it does is it gets it out of my head. And just like kind of talk-based therapies, writing stuff down is a really good way of trying to break that kind of cycle. So if you've got those particularly negative thoughts rattling around, I'd really encourage you just stream of consciousness, write without any purpose other than just getting it on paper and see, again, treat yourself as an experiment. See if that works, if that gives you some perspective, if it gives you some clarity, if it stops those thoughts. As I said, for me, it has.
I've heard I've journaled on and off over the years as well, and I heard a really good way of explaining why it's beneficial is because someone said we can think a lot faster than we can write. So normally our thoughts are a million miles an hour in 1,000 different directions, but when we focus to write it out, it stops those thoughts going in all different directions and you can get to the core of the issue before your brain goes on another tangent. So I'd imagine that's similar to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I'd never heard that, Tim. I'm going to steal that. I'll credit you though. But yeah, I really like that. And what you've just said, I mean, this is kind of what I've found, because a lot of times, humans have a tendency to catastrophize. We've got this thing called negativity bias where as a survival mechanism, we're constantly looking for threat. What could go wrong? What's the worst that could happen? These awful sort of disasters that may befall us. We're constantly scanning for these. And yeah, exactly as you said, by actually writing down the core of what it is that you're worried about, often the actual thing you're worried about is not that consequential. And the thing that's getting you emotionally worked up is your own catastrophizing, your own perspectives. And when you cut down to, okay, yeah, maybe I might have to have an awkward conversation with someone tomorrow. And, the worst that could happen is, it gets a bit awkward and I try and get my point across. And when you diffuse it like that, it makes it more manageable in a lot of cases.
100%. We overcomplicate things all the time. So when you come back to the core of it, it's not that difficult.
Yeah, and tools like journaling or, talking with a trusted friend or loved one or, ideally in the higher order, talking with a psychologist or a counsellor, they can be massive in terms of just giving that clarity.
I want to touch on perhaps one more thing. You mentioned way back in the podcast, you mentioned the word retirement. That transition for most of us in this field and in yourself, that can be daunting.
Yeah.
We're hearing a lot more about the struggles that some retired firefighters, first responders are going through. And is it because, A, they all of a sudden lose their identity or their cause? I noticed, I think Dan mentioned it in his little write-up in the book about life was going to be so great and all of a sudden things changed. So can you elaborate on that a little bit, Ben, if you could?
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. And I think this is a really, really important one. And in fact, this was in many ways the real catalyst for us developing this model. Dan's experience, my brother, Dr. Dan Pronk, as I mentioned, was in the military, was in special operations, and ended up having some issues with post-traumatic stress. And when he looked back on it, he had gotten out of the military and with a view that he was putting all this stress behind him. And so in many ways, I imagine like getting out of a first response profession, you're no longer going to those car crashes and the shift work and the calls in the middle of the night and the awful sights, sounds and smells. Yes, you're removing that stress. But what Dan didn't realize at the time was he was also actually removing a lot of the layers of his resilient shield. And it was us reflecting back on his experience and what he'd dropped off when he left the military that started to crystallize these ideas of layers. And so he'd lost a lot of that sort of professional drive and purpose, doing something bigger than yourself. He'd lost a lot of his identity in terms of a mind layer. He had, and I think a lot of us have this role identity fusion where we start seeing ourselves as a firefighter, not as Jason, Tim, Josh, I am a firefighter, I'm a soldier, I'm a SAS guy, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, if you're no longer a firefighter, it's like, well, shit, who am I? So that identity bit can be a big one. And even stuff like a lot of our social, I don't think I knew any civilians until I left the military. It turns out they're all right. Civilians are actually pretty good blokes. But I was hanging out with AJs, that was my social circle as well. And so, that pillar was removed. For Dan, the physical side of things was removed to an extent when he was no longer had the sort of time for physical training every day. So all of these pillars, it's not just changing a job, it's a lot of these things that we may not even be aware of that are buttressing our resilience. They go with the job as well. And so this is why we thought it was really important to draw attention to those things, those different aspects, and to keep an eye on them, particularly while you're still in service. The big one we often see is that we prioritise the professional, the job, over the social, the family. We figure our family's always going to be there and, we go full bore on our job and make all the job related decisions. And then all of a sudden we get spat out the other end and we don't know this person we're married to, or we haven't got the relationship we want with our kids or our mates or whatever. And so that kind of thing, I think, can be really important while you're still in. But as you're transitioning, I think this idea of, one, getting in touch with your identity, understanding what your purpose is over and above your job. Two, understanding who you are, what your authentic self is, what makes you tick, what you value, what you enjoy, and looking for activities that are going to still tick those boxes. And three, identifying that, there are going to be elements you drop off, particularly things like social context and purpose and maybe physical fitness, and looking for ways to find those in your next career can be I think just that awareness and that actively looking to sort of replace or mitigate anything you're losing along with your uniform is a pretty important part. It's actually pretty timely, and again I'll send this through. I don't even know what it's called, but Dan has just self-published another book on transition from a military perspective. But I know it's going to have a lot of those same sort of parallels to a first response. So again, I'll send you through a number of these links that may be useful to your listeners.
Oh, definitely. That'd be great.
As we wrap up then, Ben, what's the best way for people to move forward? How can they get in touch with your projects? How can they get more information on everything you've discussed here today?
Sure. ResilientShield.com, our website, is kind of ground zero for all the stuff we've got. And certainly, books are available through there. They're in most bookstores nationally, and audiobook is on Amazon and ebook on Kindle and all that sort of stuff. So, if this is something that's of interest and the model kind of resonates, then certainly more information is available through there. But the big one, I think, how do people start? Having a look either through the survey or just a reflection on your own life about, well, what aspects of your life are you comfortable with and are you doing well? What are the ones that are that maybe you could work on a bit? And then just looking for opportunities to sort of start improving in there. And it could just be really, making the most of the driving your kid to school by sort of turning off devices and having a chat, really trying to be in the moment, or, taking the flight of stairs instead of the elevator, or whatever it is if you're working on your physical side. Just those tiny little steps, doing them and acknowledging that you're doing them, celebrating them, recognizing that you are making those 1% increments. To me, that's a massive thing. I mentioned before, none of these things in and of themselves are going to change overnight, but developing those healthy habits has a massive bearing on terms of your overall resilience.
Yeah, and I think even just conversations like this start that process as well. So really appreciate you opening up and allowing us to have this conversation with you. And then I know this is going to flow on to a wider conversation within our community as well. So really appreciate your time.
No, my pleasure. And look, I want to say, I know it's sort of cliched, but it is genuinely thankful for the work that you and your fellow firefighters do across Australia. And yeah, I'm more than happy to keep helping in whatever way we can.
Fantastic, mate. And I think, again, that's reciprocated. Your sacrifices along with, everyone else in that unit. We thank you. And it all stems back, for me, the biggest thing that I got out of all of this is, doesn't matter what path our journey takes, if we've got that resilience, we can pretty much almost cope and deal with any situation that may arise. I think your brother, yourself and Tim is such a great vehicle to be driving this, because you've got so much respect from the nation. And I think it's very, from a firefighter perspective, we're going to listen, because the importance of your
That's
role.
awesome.
Yeah. So thanks again, mate. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Ben Pronk and took something from it you can implement for positive change in your life. As Ben mentioned, there's plenty more information available on his website, resilienceShield.com, including the Resilience Shield survey, which can help you to identify areas which might assist you to develop your own individual resilience. Our hope for having conversations like this is to give you as many tools as possible to improve your overall well-being. Remember also, FESN offers a wide range of support mechanisms. If you are in need of support in any way, please reach out and know that you are not alone. Take care of yourselves and watch out for those around you. This episode was recorded and produced by the Brisbane Region Training and Improvement Unit.